I'm going to ask you to put your hands up and say, when you just say the thing you really wanted to know when you came here this morning. If you walked into here saying, when Professor Rickhouse comes to speak, what's the question I really want the answer to? I'm going to write those questions down on that whiteboard, and then I'm going to make a lecture based on those questions. Okay, that's the challenge. I hope it works. And for it to work, you've got to ask the questions. If not, we've got death by PowerPoint instead. So I'm relying on you to save yourself from yet another PowerPoint lecture. So, what did you come here wanting to know? So if you've got something, just stick your hand up and shout. Anything about behavior, mental state change, anything. I already know there's some things out there because people have already asked me some questions. So, hands up. Yes, red jersey.
What's the first most common symptom of Huntington's?
All right, what's the most common behavioral symptom?
The very first.
Okay. Most common, okay. First thing. Good question. Next. Got one here.
Do you believe that some people skip some stages?
Skipping stages.
Like the example, so my granddad had it. Everyone always says about the temper and the angry side of it as one of the starting points.
Yeah.
He never seemed to get that at all.
Okay.
So is that like a common?
Okay, skipping. Yeah, okay. Skipping symptoms. Yes, any more? Yes, one there.
Is dementia inevitable, or do some people,
Okay.
is it different in Huntington's?
Is dementia inevitable? That's a fabulous question. Yes, next. Green shirt.
Is the mental debilitation incremental, or does it tend to plateau and then fall down?
Fabulous. Fabulous question. I love your questions. Okay, yes. Yes, at the front there, blue shirt.
See what Tina said about the early symptoms?
Yeah.
Very common to say early symptoms in normal people because of you're looking for the symptoms, so very common to say symptoms.
I really feel like you guys must have been taught philosophy at school or something. You're asking these lovely sort of very general, interesting questions. The question was again?
That was the early symptoms.
Yeah.
People,
Oh, they're normal. Oh, yeah. Is it normal?
everybody or
Yeah, yeah. That's what I mean. That's why it's a philosophical question. It's like, what is normal? Yes. Any more questions? Yes, blue shirt.
Is the interaction between sleep and the circadian rhythm
Circadian rhythms and sleep.
the influence of mental health?
Okay. Any more? Anything about particular symptoms? You've asked some quite general sorts of questions. Any sort of bothersome symptoms? Hands up. Bothersome symptoms or signs that you want to talk about? Yes. Compulsiveness. Okay. Okay. Yes.
Is there any relationship between trauma and the onset of Huntington's?
What do you mean, like mental trauma or brain trauma?
Mental trauma or physical trauma? Being in an accident or something?
Oh, well, being in a car accident or something. Okay, gosh. Yeah. Trauma. Okay. You guys are asking very sort of, I would say, general questions, but they're around the outside a little bit. I'm going to put in a couple of real central questions that I think are central questions that you might want to hear about, but you can always shout me down because it's your lecture. So some of the other things I was going to talk about were depression, irritability, apathy, and overload. So I'm going to put these down, then we'll go to the next stage then. So, depression, irritability, apathy, overload. Now, the next bit of the game is I'm going to read all these out in a list, and if you really want to hear about it, I want you to clap really loudly or shout or holler. If you don't want to hear about it, just keep sort of quite quiet, and then we'll gauge the room and we'll focus on the things that are most important. Bear in mind it's quite a long list, so don't just, people have a tendency to shout a lot at the beginning and then get bored at the end. So have a look at the list and think about the thing you really want to know about and really holler for that thing. So, first one is it normal? So, is this behavior normal? Do you want to hear about that? Okay, fine. What's the most common first thing? Who wants to hear about that? Okay, you Beamer. Could some people skip some symptoms and just go, you know, have like not have any irritability or temper or something? Do you want to hear about that? Is dementia inevitable? Do people want to hear about that? A little bit. Is it incremental? People want to hear about that? Okay, you're all even Stevens now. Sleep problems. People want to hear about that? Maybe a little bit more. Okay. Compulsive behaviors. People want to hear about that? Maybe. Gosh, you're all like, maybe. Who wants to hear about depression? A little bit more. Who wants to hear about irritability and temper? Yeah, there's definitely a bit more fun. God, you're all going middle, aren't you, with this? Who wants to hear about apathy? Oh, yeah, there's a bit for that. And who wants to hear about cognitive overload? You guys don't quite know what you want to hear about, do you? Sorry, what was that at the back there? Everything. Okay, well, let's just do everything then. I'm just trying to find a way that I can look at this whilst talking. We can deal with some of these quite quickly, and then some of those will take a little bit more time. So, the most common first thing. Who asked the most? What's the most common first thing question? Who was that? Yeah, it really varies. I guess one thing you've got to realise is that if you have Huntington's disease, it doesn't start when the neurologist says it starts. We're born with this condition, so it's a gene that makes basically a toxic protein, which is there since conception, but it's just not a very toxic protein. So it accumulates in cells from the get-go. And we think that humans deviate from what their normal trajectory would have been, probably, I reckon, on average, about 20 years before diagnosis. So in other words, we're deviating from the path we would have taken very, very many years before you sit down in a consulting room and a neurologist says, I have to tell you you have Huntington's disease. It's happened a long time before that. And I think most people who have the experience of it will say that they know that and they understand that. So what that means is that the first symptoms can be hard to tell because they might just be variations on what it is to be a normal human being. And that's why it's difficult. And that brings me to the question from the lady in the yellow blouse at the front there, which is, well, I'll give you an example. I'm definitely grumpier now and more irritable than I was, let's say, 10 years ago. I'm sort of, I suppose, getting a bit of a grumpy old man, as many of us do. And so I am more irritable, I'm more snappy. I probably don't suffer fools as gladly, and if somebody pisses me off, I'm probably more likely to snap at them a bit than I did 10 years ago. But that doesn't make me have Huntington's disease. So how can you tell? And the answer is, you can't always tell. Secondly, you've got to take it in context. So you've got to really think about what the person was like before, and if they change more than you would expect. So that's quite a subtle difference. So you can't always tell. Sometimes the change in behavior becomes so extreme that it's absolutely obvious, as long as you don't know what the other causes are. So the question of what the most common first thing is it could be anything, but it's probably more likely to be a subtle change in behavior and attitude and mental state, like getting a little bit more rigid about things, or finding multitasking a little bit more difficult, or finding it more difficult to understand social situations. So I guess that's the most common thing, but the problem is that blurs into normal, and that can be difficult to tell. So it's common that people will say that their partner with Huntington's disease has just become a little bit moody and a little bit You know, you think, oh, maybe he's just having a midlife crisis or something like that. Or it's just being a little bit less sociable, a little bit less talkative, not picking up on social things quite the same way. So those are the usual first signs, but it's really difficult to spot them because it's sort of normal too. Skipping symptoms. Somebody asked about skipping symptoms, like, is it possible that you won't get any behavioural symptoms at all? Or you won't get any motor symptoms at all? Well, it does happen, yeah. And the issue with that's a bit like the dementia thing. It sort of depends how long you live, because we're vulnerable to other diseases too. So it might be that you never had any motor symptoms, and then you had another illness like a cancer or a heart attack or something, and so you died before the time you would have got the other symptoms. I guess most people who live long enough will get at least some of all of the symptoms. But we don't all live till 90, do we? So we don't know for sure what's going to happen. And the same applies to dementia, really. Is that not everybody with Huntington's disease will get full dementia? And that's because I think everybody will get some sort of cognitive change. But usually when we talk about dementia, we talk about impairment in all areas of mental functioning. And not everybody with HD gets that. I mean, almost everybody will get some sort of change. The thing that many of you will notice, and it's a problem with the idea of what we call dementia, is dementia was designed as an idea for people with Alzheimer's disease. It wasn't really designed as an idea for people with Huntington's disease, because if you look at the way dementia is diagnosed, it's really about memory. Memory is a fundamental thing in the way that dementia is normally diagnosed. But many people with Huntington's disease have very good memories till quite late in the illness. You know, there's a program on TV in England called The Chase. Do you watch that show? So when I'm testing people in clinic, I say, oh, do you watch The Chase? And I just say 95% of my patients watch The Chase with their wife or husband. And quite a lot of them, the one with HD says they're somewhat better than the spouse at The Chase, which is basically what we call semantic memory. It's memory for facts about the world. And actually that bit of HD is often very well preserved until fairly late in the illness. And so aspects of cognition like that are pretty good. But aspects of cognition like having to multitask, so having two or three things thrown at you at the same time to have to do, or having to work out what somebody else is thinking or what their perspective might be on a situation, or how to imagine the future, that might be really impaired quite early on. So that's why I guess the idea of dementia doesn't really do HD a lot of service, because it was defined really around Alzheimer's disease, and Alzheimer's disease is defined around memory loss, or what we call amnesia. So yes, cognitive change is the case in all people. Dementia, as we currently understand it, isn't inevitable in everybody. And also, we don't all live forever, so we may die for some other reason before we get dementia. And I suppose if everybody lived till 120 with HD, they probably would all get dementia. But 120 is a big old age, isn't it? Is it incremental? Right, that's a great question. Well, Huntington's in general is incremental. In other words, things tend to, gradually worsen over time. But that doesn't apply to all behaviors. So behaviors and mental states can change and be different and can sometimes improve rather than get worse through the illness. So for instance, if you study some bits of behavior, depression is a good example. Now, depression is most common in the early stages of the disease and much less common in the later stages of the disease. And irritability tends to wear off as the disease progresses in most cases, but not in every case. And it can depend on the cause, actually. So I guess, yeah, there are some symptoms that start and then they will die off as the patient becomes more ill. Chorea is another example of a symptom like that. Patients can start early with a bit of chorea, and then they can get a lot of chorea in the mid-stage of the disease, and then towards the later stages of the disease, hardly get any at all. So I guess if you could say, in the terms of the pathology of the brain, at the moment this is an incremental illness, but in terms of individual symptoms, no, not necessarily. And also there are a bunch of symptoms that can be treated. So for instance, if you take depression, Well, depression is quite common in people with Huntington's disease, but it's pretty readily treatable. You can really treat it, and so in that case, it's not incremental at all. It can go away. And you may know yourself, there are many people with Huntington's disease that can live very contented lives, relatively free from mental distress, but they may not realize the mental distress that their families are under, which is another problem, and which we'll talk about. Okay. That really makes me want to talk about depression a bit more. So is it okay if I talk about depression for a while, and then we'll go on with that to talk about irritability? So, most people who come into my clinic with HD are not depressed. They don't have depression, but having said that, most people with HD will get depression at some point during the illness. It's just they have episodes of depression, and they're usually either self-limiting or they can be treated effectively. So the majority of people I see in my clinic aren't depressed, and when they are depressed, we can usually treat them. It can be difficult to diagnose depression in HD, because in HD of its own, you get a lot of the symptoms that you might think of as depression, but aren't. Like poor sleep is a good example, weight loss is another good example, finding it difficult to motivate yourself is a good example. And so those sorts of symptoms don't help you very well, but the symptoms that do help, there's one particular symptom that really helps in diagnosing depression in HD, that's called anhedonia. Anhedonia means you can't take pleasure in everyday things. I don't mean you taking pleasure in a roller coaster or Christmas. I mean, for instance, when I woke up this morning, I knew I was going to go to the rugby club next door and watch the game. And I wasn't ecstatic, but I was gently happy about that. And the next thing that's happened is that I had a cup of tea. It was about 7:30. I had a cup of tea. I sipped the cup of tea, and it was like, nice cup of tea. I don't know whether any of you have experienced that the first sip of the first cup of tea of the day and going, oh, that's nice. It's not intense pleasure, is it? It's just gentle pleasure in the everyday. And that's the thing that you will lose in depression. That's the thing. And if you lost that for everything for, let's say, a month, then you might consider depression being a thing. The other things you might see to diagnose depression are waking early in the morning, really feeling agitated and down, but then towards the end of the day starting to feel a little bit better, although not completely better. This is something we call diurnal variation. This idea that you wake up maybe 4:30, 5 in the morning, you're really mithered, really anxious, and low in mood, but then as the day wears on, you feel somewhat better. To be honest, I would say that is at least as common in carers and spouses as it is in people with HD. Perhaps towards the later stages, more common, in fact. The other thing that people can mistake for depression in HD is apathy. So that means really not doing very much every day. So I'll share you a little case that I had this week, because I had a clinic on Tuesday, and a woman came in with her husband, and the husband is probably in mid-stages of HD, and he likes to sit in his bedroom and watch nature videos. They've got 2 teenage children, and the grass needs mowing, and the wife is working, because she has to, because who's going to bring the money in? And I asked him, and they're going crazy with him, because he's sitting in bed most of the day watching David Attenborough and the Blue Planet, or whatever it happens to be. And I asked him, what goes through your head when you're sitting there? Are you thinking, oh God, the wife's going to go home, I haven't even mowed the lawn? He said, no, most of the time I just think, this is a nice program on the telly. And I think that's first of all, that's not depression at all, even though he's in his bed, under the duvet all day long, having previously functioned well. Sounds a bit like depression. But you ask the guy, he's fine. He's completely fine. His wife is run ragged because she's got to come home. First of all, he's not done the garden. She's had to do the work, bring home the bacon, make the kids' tea, get the washing on, do the project management for the whole family. And he hasn't got the mental ability to imagine what that might be like. He's lost the mental ability to imagine that, so he's fine. He's just sitting there. And this is what I say in our clinic. We get these things which I call facepalm moments in clinic. Now, the facepalm moment, which happens, I would say, in probably over half of my consultations. is that you come in, the patient will come in with their wife or husband, and you'll say to the patient, how are you? And the patient will say, I'm fine, thanks, doc. And then the wife or the husband will start crying. And then the patient will look over at the wife or husband, and sort of the look on their face will be, why are you crying? I can't see what this is about. And then the wife will keep crying, or the husband will keep crying, and the spouse will like put their hand on their leg and go, they sort of know something's going on, but they don't really know what's going on. And so they're trying to do what they think they ought to do. So, gosh, that's a lot of things to talk about, isn't it? I want to just we'll come back to that little bit in a bit, but I want to take it back to apathy. So quite often people with HD who don't do much are not being lazy at all, and they're not amenable to the sort of discussion you'd have with your partner if you thought they were being lazy. You know, it's like, okay, if you're not going to do these jobs, then I'm going to withdraw the following things and I'm going to stop doing this, and then we'll see where we're at. You know, they're not amenable to that approach at all because they genuinely, most of the time, can't imagine what the things are to be done. And for those of you in the room without HD, just try and imagine if you didn't spend a lot of time thinking about what you were going to do next. And think about how much of the time in your life you spend thinking about what I'm going to do next. Like, for instance, pretty much everybody, when they lie in bed in the morning, at least some of the time they're thinking about what is it am I getting up for? You know, I lay in bed this morning, I was thinking about the rugby, I was thinking about the talk, I was thinking about maybe going to run later. All those things are in my head, little scenarios about what might happen in the future, and that's my motivation for getting up. And if I was depressed, I might think of all those things and think, well, they're all rubbish and they wouldn't be any fun, that's why I'm not getting up. But for most people with HD, what's happening is a failure before that. They're just not really thinking about those things. They're probably thinking the bed is comfy, or they might be thinking, I need to go to the loo, or I'm a bit hungry. But they might not be thinking, oh, the grass needs mowing, I've got to go to the DIY shop, or whatever it is. And so not doing anything is quite commonly a problem with imagining future scenarios. Sometimes people with HD can imagine future things and they want to do things, but then there's another problem, which is a problem with initiating. So I know we all have this. Sometimes I've had it myself. You know, you're in bed and you think of the things you've got to do, and you know you really want to do them, but that final sort of magic spark that makes you pull the duvet off, that bit gets missing sometimes. And that's a problem in HD too. It's a problem for all of us, but particularly in HD. So when they can imagine or they're told something to do and they're like, right, let's do this thing, then that final spark which gets you going, it's almost a microsecond, isn't it, between getting out of bed and staying in bed for another half an hour. But that initiation, like, right, let's go, can be missing too. So it's failure of sort of imagining future scenarios and the failure of initiating in the absence of depression. So we're going to talk a little bit about imagination now, because that's where the social cognitive problems come in. So imagining things. Most of the things that we imagine are to do with anything else but here and now. So you're imagining something that might happen in the future, in another place, at another time, but also you're imagining how another person might feel. That's another form of imagining. I wonder how so-and-so's feeling about this. So I'm standing here thinking, oh, I wonder how the audience is feeling about my talk. A bit anxious about that. I wonder how you're all feeling. I hope I'm going to make it okay, and I'm looking for some smiles, a bit of reassurance, and I'm wondering how you're all feeling and trying to judge how you're feeling. So we spend a lot of time in our heads normally imagining other times and places and other people's perspectives. I'd just like you to, for those people in the room who don't have HD, I'd just like you to spend a couple of seconds imagining what it would feel like not to have that ability and not to really know that you didn't have it. What the consequences of that might be? Well, we've talked about one of the consequences is that you might not do anything because you might not be able to imagine the things that you would do. But also it might mean that you couldn't really understand what everybody else was making such a fuss about, or what the things that they had to do to keep the show on the road. And you might not understand, for instance, if your partner was looking angry or upset or stressed, you might not really see that, or you might not see the big picture things. And this is what takes me to the other idea of Huntington's disease. Do people know much about Asperger's syndrome or autism? It's something that's in the papers and we hear about. And it's a really good way of thinking of Huntington's. It's sort of like an acquired Asperger's syndrome of middle age. In other words, that gradually people lose the ability to understand another person's point of view. And that can be literal as well as metaphorical. So for instance, if I show people this, you know what this is a little channel changer projectors, and say, what do you think I can see? You have to put yourself into my eyes and imagine what I'm seeing. And most people will say, okay, I know, Hugh, you can see the buttons, the on switch and the off switch and the channel changer and all those other things. So you have to put yourself behind my eyes. And that's a very literal thing, but that's also a metaphorical thing too. So you have to imagine not only what another person could see, but what another person might think or feel. And that's a lot of the language about those things is the same. You know, can you see it from my point of view? Can you see things from my perspective? So a lot of that emotional language is also very visual language too. And what we know about the brain is that the bits of the brain that do that thing, they do both of those things in the same place. So imagining a person's metaphorical point of view is neurologically quite similar to imagining their actual visual point of view. And the same bits of the brain go wrong. And the interesting thing about that is that we tried this in people with Huntington's disease. We gave them a bunch of Asperger tests, if you like. And people with HD tend to not do well on those tests. And the bits of their brain that don't activate are the same as the bits of the brain that don't activate in Asperger's syndrome. So that's why I say Huntington's disease can be like developing Asperger's syndrome for the first time and gradually in middle age. And that we get a bit distracted by the moving around business, because actually for most people the moving around business is not that bothersome. But it's something that's easier to see. So imagine also that if you get together with a partner who may be of a particular type, they're very empathic or they're very caring and very thoughtful, and then they become gradually much and much less so. Imagine what a strain that must be, even though the person appears sort of okay really on the outside. But that can be quite devastating for people. Right, so we slightly deviated, but not much. I'm going to talk about irritability now. So irritability is common. Back to your question, you're like, is it normal? Oh, that was your question, wasn't it? We're all irritable, aren't we? I'm irritable, but it takes a lot. Even these days, it takes a lot. And one of the things that makes us irritable is having a lot of things to do all at the same time and feeling anxious that they won't get done. So, you're trying to cook the tea and one of your children's pulling at your leg saying, come and look at this on the telly. And then somebody's at the door and then the phone's ringing. And then somebody else is like, why isn't tea ready yet? Then most of us would get irritable at that moment. I think you'd have to be a saint not to snap if that was the situation. But with HD, if you can imagine that people find it difficult to deal with a bunch of things all at once, then actually the threshold for getting irritable goes right down. So it might be something as simple as, oh, my mum's coming around for tea with the grandkids. That might be more than enough to make a person feel quite stressed, like that's a lot of stuff going on right there, and would be snappy. Not on purpose, but just because the level of cognitive complexity that a person can deal with is much more limited than it used to be. So things happen as a result of that. So I've seen this happen many a time. So, I don't know, your sister comes around with the kids for tea, and then the person with HD mysteriously disappears and is up in their bedroom for 2 hours. And everybody says, oh, what's the matter with him or her? They're such a grumpy party pooper, not very nice, being sulky. And actually for that person, they're just finding all that stuff difficult to cope with. There's too much going on, especially with little kids. And we're all expected to love little children. That's the name of the game, isn't it? When the grandkids come around, we think that's marvelous. But actually for a person with HD, that could be really stressful. So it's about understanding that and taking that into account. So it might be, for instance, I work with people and I say, okay, when the grandkids come round, say hello to them, take 5 minutes for them, and then take a break. Go and sit in your room, it's fine, we won't think badly of you. Come back in 20, 40 minutes, have another 5-minute session, go back again. We accept that. So you've got a different set of rules. The same thing is if a person has apathy, then, we don't expect you to do all those things. We're just trying to, we might give you a list, we might let you, prompt you about the things that absolutely have to be done, but we have to do some accepting too that it's really hard, unless we're prepared to do it with you and get someone else to do it with you, which is not always possible. So, what do we do about irritability? I guess the first thing we do is we look at situations and we try to work out what's going on. One of the big causes of irritability can be physical illness. So I think a take-home message is, if a person with HD is irritable, don't just say, oh, it's the HD, it makes you irritable. It needs more work than that, a lot more work. The first thing is, you might be a naturally irritable person, in which case it's normal for you, which is back to your question. Secondly, somebody else might have genuinely said something to make you really irritable, in which case it's justified. So people with HD can get irritable for justifiable reasons and don't want it just writing off as being HD. Thirdly, there may be a bunch of physical problems, especially if the person isn't able to tell you. So this is for later on. So that might be pain, toothache, constipation, infection, the medicines that you're on, a million things like that. Or it might be overload, mental overload, or it could be social misunderstanding. In other words, if something's going on, I had a good one actually. I had a wife, a woman with Huntington's disease and the husband, they'd always got on for many years because he used ironic humour with her and with the family. And then suddenly she started getting really antsy at him, and that's because she stopped being able to understand ironic humour. Again, ironic humour requires this sort of big picture thinking stuff, I think, and she was starting to find that difficult to do. So whenever he was laughing and joking ironically at her, she thought he was being absolutely straight up and got really angry with him for that. And so he had to change his stance, which is, okay, with the kids I can still use the ironic humour, but with the wife I'm going to have to sort of make it a little bit more concrete and find a different way of interacting. So quite often, the nature of the illness is, perhaps unfairly you might say, but it's reality, is that the spouse has to do all the altering, because the person with the HD probably loses the ability to do that altering thing. So it's quite commonly the burden falls on the spouse to do things differently. And the spouse usually says, well, aren't I doing enough things already? Not only am I bringing home the bacon and project managing the home and managing you, not only that, I have to change my behaviour towards you too and be a different person to how I would normally be. That's a huge burden on spouses. Okay, where are we? Irritability. Oh yeah, so with irritability, just look for triggers. So you've ruled out the infections and the metabolic things and the constipation, then do simple ABCs. ABC stands for antecedents, behaviours, consequences. So I'll give you an example, see if you can work it out. I gave it to a bunch of professionals yesterday, and one managed it. So this is last Tuesday in clinic, again, a man with HD. He's in a nursing home, and he doesn't say a lot, to be fair to him. And the staff are saying to me, he's very, very irritable. Because usually staff come from nursing homes say, he's very irritable, he's kicking off. Can you give him some sedative medication? That's the classic one. And you go, well, hang on a minute, what's happening? And his wife said to me, he's always only irritable between 7 and 9 in the evenings. Every evening, well, not every evening, but most evenings. So anybody have any ideas about why somebody might be preferentially irritable between 7 and 9 in the evening? What? Sundown. Okay, could be sundowning. But he gets a bit better after 9, so it could, sometimes people with brain conditions it gets harder as the day wears on, but you wouldn't expect him to perk up at 9 if that was the case.
That's when all the soaps are on the TV.
Ah, that's a good one. That's, you know, that's a cracking, that is a I didn't think of that one. You know, you watch an episode of EastEnders and they've all had a massive fight or something and everybody's shouting at everybody. Maybe you could, that's a, you know, I hadn't thought of that. You've put another little note in my book. Anything else that happens in the evening time in nursing homes? Medicine rounds, yeah, nice one, could be. Visiting is the other one. Now, it turned out, when we looked at this closely, it wasn't every visiting time that this happened. So it happened, so there was two ways in which the person could be visited. One by their wife, and the other by the family as a total. So if it was just a visit by the wife, he was fine. If it was a visit by the whole family, he got really irritable. If it was nobody visited, he got really irritable. And so it just took a little bit of homework to work that out, that actually no visitors, well, he got irritable because he was like, where's my wife? And this is the other thing about people with HD is that they, a bit like Asperger's, they can get fixated on times and routines. So it's like, well, my wife always comes at 7 o'clock, and it's 7 o'clock and she's not here. And even if the wife has said, I'm not coming tomorrow, they might not have remembered that or chosen not to remember it. And they'll be like, it's 7 o'clock, the wife comes at 7, and the wife isn't here, so I'm kicking off right now. Even if it's 2 minutes past 7. So that's one of those things. The other one is, when all the family come, they're all talking, and it's too much information, and they're usually not talking to him either, they're talking to themselves about this, that, and the other, and he's feeling irritable because he can't really join in, and they're not giving him a chance. They're not waiting to let him speak. So there's a bunch of things he wants to say, but that means normal rules of family conversation have to be suspended. You know, he's like, oh, what happened today? And then somebody else comes in and somebody else comes in. And then the person with HD is like, I'm just preparing to speak now, but there's no chance I can get a gap in the conversation to say anything. And that's also pissing me off. So that can happen too. So it's a good example. I had another one, just to give you an example about how this can work. A lady in a nursing home, the nursing home staff saying, she's screaming every morning, shouting and screaming every morning. And it always goes away about 11 o'clock. So another timing issue. So we went through what happens in the morning. Well, she gets up, staff are washing and dressing her, that all seems to go fine. And then she has a breakfast. Okay, what does she have for a breakfast? 2 cigarettes and a cup of black coffee. Okay, how's the morning going? When's the next food? About 11:30, there's hot chocolate and a biscuit. And then at 11:30, 12 o'clock, she's fine again. So she was actually hungry, number one, hungry, big one. Number 2, gastritis, big one. So actually, because she couldn't really explain, it really hurts here and I'm starving. And she had a coffee and 2 fags for breakfast because that's what she always did. So when the staff realised that, she had a cup of hot chocolate, a couple of biscuits, and some Gaviscon for her breakfast, and she was good to go. Dead on, as you would say. Dead on. Okay. I forgot to mention another aspect of HD, which is called perseveration. Some people say, I suppose it's related to the man's question about compulsions and obsessions, but we'll come to the compulsion bit in a bit. So, there's a thing with people with HD. Saoirse, how long have I got? 10 minutes. There's a thing with HD called perseveration. I would call it getting a bee in your bonnet about something. It's a really common thing. So a person with HD will commonly start thinking or feeling in a particular way and find it really difficult to switch off from that. And they probably won't even think that they need to switch off about it. So the sort of thing is, you know, you're having a conversation as a family and you're talking about a particular subject and you've moved on from that subject and you're talking about something else. But the person with HD is still stuck on the thing you were talking about 15 minutes ago. And, you know, in the course of normal conversation, that's a bit unusual. And you're like, come on, Dad, or whatever. You know, we're already talking about something completely different. And the person with HD finds it really difficult to make that shift. So people with HD can get, I don't know whether this is a phrase in Northern Ireland, a bee in your bonnet. Okay, it is. It's not that different a culture. And where they'll just think about something and talk about something all the time, all day, every day, and they literally can't think about anything else. And of course, being able to swap your ideas or swap your thinking to something else is what humans need to get on, really, in every day. And if you're just focused on one thing, that also means there's a whole bunch of things that you're not thinking about that you need to be thinking about. And that can be really difficult. Sometimes it's hard for the person with HD too. I'll give you an example of that. I had a patient, a really nice lady who went to a day centre, and she had a lovely husband who she loved to pieces, and it was Valentine's Day, and she made him the nicest Valentine's card you could possibly imagine. And they were in their 40s or 50s, so they weren't spring chickens. But anyway, love was in the air. So she made this Valentine's card for him, and she was so pleased and so happy that he loved his Valentine's card, and she had that real sort of big swelling of happiness and love that you feel. But you know when you have that feeling, after a while it just dies down a little bit, and you get on with the next thing. For her, it just wouldn't die down, and it actually became unpleasant for her. Because if you feel like that all the time, it's quite sort of, it's a bit stressy as well. And so she's like, I have this feeling of happiness, but it's gone on for such a long time that it's really making me miserable and unhappy, and I can't shift it at all. So she got really stuck in that. And I guess that's an unusual example of perseveration. But the classic example is people who think about one thing all day long, every day, all long, and it's really hard for the partner because they're like, well, you know, it's 2 days before the appointment with the doctor, and they're going, are we going to the doctor in 2 days? Yes, we're going to the doctor. When are we going? When can this happen? Yes, it's happening tomorrow. Don't worry about it. Yeah, but when are we going? And then they go away and they'll come back in 2 minutes and go, it's a doctor's in 2 days, isn't it? And I see this all the time. And, you know, you go, okay, with doctors, it's all sorted. Don't even think about it, because I've got everything under control. That's what the partner says. But the person with HD is like, keeps thinking about it. And then, of course, the partner will get really irritated with them. And they'll be like, shut up about the doctors already. It's 48 hours till we've got to go. And they're like, yeah, but how are we going to get there? And he's like, we're in the car like normal. Will we find a parking place? And they'll go away and they'll be thinking about it again. And, you know, that makes communication between partners really difficult, I think, because normally you'd probably just shout at a person if they didn't have HD in that situation. Maybe if they do, you'd just say, oh, God, shut up about the doctors already, or whatever it happens to be. It's a normal human response. But you have to understand that perseveration is part of the HD condition, and that's hard to accept. Okay, we've done a lot of these things, actually. I did notice the question of sleep. Whew, that's a whole lecture. It's a whole lecture. I will say that people with HD, particularly later on, get multiple levels of sleep problems. And the causes are massive, but you have to remember that the bits of the brain that are involved with monitoring 24-hour rhythms actually get damaged quite early in HD, so you're at a biological disadvantage already. So that if you look in mice, there's some little cells in the middle at the bottom of the brain in a place called the hypothalamus that regulate your 24-hour cycle. And if you look at mice, those cells start to dysfunction quite early in HD mice. And there's no reason to suspect it would be any different in HD humans. So you're already fighting against biology. On top of that, there are a bunch of other things that can disturb sleep, and we know moving around can disturb sleep, and it can disturb the carer's sleep as well. We know that depression can disturb sleep, or anxiety can disturb sleep. We know that pain can disturb sleep, and I guess pain is one of the really untalked about HD symptoms, especially sort of generalized limb pain is really common and not talked about because HD research world doesn't have many pain specialists. So we've sort of tried to not think about it too much. But our patients keep telling us their arms and legs hurt and it's not very responsive to treatment. So that can stop you from sleeping. So there's a bunch of things that can stop you from sleeping. The other thing that can stop you from sleeping is if you sleep all day or you don't do very much in the day. So apathy keys into not sleeping. So if my friend who stays in bed watching nature documentaries all day, guess what? He doesn't sleep very well at night, not very surprisingly. So I guess I'm going to need to nearly wrap up now. I just wanted to make Is that, yeah, I'm on wrapping up time, Sorters? 5 minutes, yeah, I've got a 5-minute wrap up though, so we'll do the 5-minute wrap up. I think I've covered most of these areas, not in detail because it's only a single lecture. I guess a couple of things I wanted to say to the community as a whole, really, general points. The first thing, I think the hardest thing, a real hard thing is for spouses, are the halves, because I think a lot of you, a lot of the time, are going through a sort of grief reaction for the spouse, even though they're still there in the room with you, and they may even be in the room with you now, but they're changing, and they quite commonly don't see the extent to which they're changing, and you have to carry that burden with you all the time. And I've just wanted to sort of reach out to spouses and say, that's a really tough role, because on top of that, you're probably doing a lot of the project managing too, of all the other things that need doing. And I hope, I'm sure your organisation is there for you, but your patients, the patient side of it, they've got their doctors and things, but the spouse side of it, it gets a bit overlooked sometimes. But I'm sure HDANI doesn't overlook you at all. But it's a tough and it's a lonely old world. So I'm just reaching out to you and say, I feel for you in that situation being a spouse, because it's a tough role. Not that it's not tough being a patient, because it is tough too. I just also wanted to make a little speech or a little talk about the future, a bit of future scoping, and I was just talking to Raymond. I was just talking to Raymond about this earlier, and Ed Wild will talk to you about this later. We're heading into the era of potential disease-modifying treatments, and that's amazing, but also, I guess, in scientific terms, that's going incredibly fast. In human terms, for you sitting here in this room, it probably feels incredibly, incredibly slowly. Having said that, I think we're in an era where disease-modifying drugs will be on the market with a fair wind, in 5 years or so. And so there will be potential disease-modifying drugs that are, available to be bought and given to patients. But right now, that doesn't mean to say if that were the case and the trials were successful, that you could just walk down the chemists, get everybody with HD could just get those drugs and start taking them. Those drugs are going to be super expensive, and as I've forgotten your name, sir? Jerry. As Jerry was saying, it requires governments to make decisions about, what they're going to spend their healthcare pounds on, and it's not going to be cheap. I can guarantee you that based on the experience with other neurological illnesses. There's going to be, at the moment, the way the treatments are going, they look like injections into the spinal fluid, so that needs a neurological bed and a neurological registrar and some nurses. That's not cheap. And the company who are pioneering this drug, Roche, they have thrown tens of hundreds of millions of pounds at this, so they're going to want a return on their investment, not only that in cash terms, but for their shareholders too. So they're not going to put a cheap price tag on this drug. So I'm sort of reaching out to you, and not as if you haven't got enough on your plate, quite honestly, to say that this needs thinking about now. It's a wake-up call to people, and it's to the organisation too, and the board, to start thinking, okay, let's do some planning now, and some lobbying. Who you're going to lobby, I know, the unnamed civil servant who doesn't have a master, because my nightmare scenario is if we have a drug that actually has a decent disease-modifying potential in HD and only millionaires get it, that will be I think that might even be worse than not having one. So I think we've got to, as an organisation, we've got to really start thinking, we've got to wake up to that and start thinking and taking lessons from other diseases. I mean, I could name you other diseases. I'm looking at Sorsha now. I could name you other diseases like spinal muscular atrophy with Spinraza, cystic fibrosis with Orkambi, Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Those, and even going back, the big stories about availability and accessibility of drugs for HIV. That's an amazing story, and the campaign that people with HIV and their relatives ran, along with their organisations, to get us to the position we are now, where an amazingly high proportion of people with HIV are now getting access to effective drugs, which initially they didn't at all.